Hey folks, it's Swank Ivy. I'm doing another Letters to an Asexual. I think this is number 52. So if I am wrong about that, then I'm sorry, but I don't feel like going back to check and see what number I'm on. I think it's 52. So I'm going to talk today about something that might be sort of controversial or uncomfortable for some people. Straight up, it's about masturbation. And it is about some of the nuanced perspectives regarding whether that should be some kind of distinction in our community. I don't think so. That's a behavior, just like whether you choose to have sexual intercourse or whether you choose to have a relationship. You know, there are these behaviors that you can do and still just use the term asexual if that's what applies to you. That is what you identify as. It describes your orientation, your attraction experiences, and I don't really think that there's any reason to have like this huge distinction in whether you're libidoist or whatever you want to call it, and what behaviors you participate in as an asexual person. And one of the things that I don't really get around to saying in this conversation I'm going to read you, I think that I never quite got around to saying, like, you don't have straight people making a distinction as to whether they're a particular shade of straight if they masturbate or they don't. You don't have gay people making a determination of whether they're gay or a specific subsection of gay depending on whether they masturbate. So why would there be a special case for us? So ultimately, I think a lot of people get hung up on this idea that masturbation is a sexual behavior. And you know, I don't want to make too many people uncomfortable talking about this, but many children masturbate, and it's even like a behavior that has been observed in the womb. Bottom line is, most people, if they find it pleasurable to touch a pleasure center of their body, then, you know, they'll do it, even if they don't have context for what that means to adults. And of course, any adult that masturbates probably has, you know, a different perspective on it than a child does. But the bottom line is, just because something involves your genitals does not mean that it's a sexual thing, and it also doesn't necessarily mean that your attraction experiences can't be described by the word asexual. People get really hung up on that for some reason. They get this idea that asexual has to mean asexual in every sense of the word. Like, I've even had people say it's the wrong word for me to use for myself if I have any sexual organs, which of course is kind of ridiculous. So I'm going to read you a conversation, and it's a pretty uncomfortable one. It's a really frustrating one. And I ended up uncharacteristically not replying to someone, even though I thought they were wrong at the end of the day, because it was so aggressive, and it was so, like, layered with, there was something going on there where this person, as you'll see, is accusing me of misrepresenting myself or hurting the asexual community because of how I describe myself or the behavior of people in the asexual community. It was really just, it was an extremely uncomfortable conversation where I felt like they were attacking me or they were trying to shame me. And as you'll see also, that they were accusing me of being ashamed. Full disclosure, what they bring up in the conversation, as you'll see, is that I have talked about masturbation in other contexts where I don't identify as a person who masturbates or has a libido. I just don't really experience any of that as an adult. But, you know, my parents had said, yeah, you went through a phase where, you know, like, you played with yourself when you were a kid. And it's like, lots of people do that. Like I said, you go through a phase where you pick your nose, maybe. It's like, it's not like that defines who you are as an adult, or that it precludes you identifying as not being a nose picker. You know, I mean, you know what I mean? It's kind of ridiculous to say that if you ever did anything as a child that you didn't understand the context for, or you did it in an exploratory context, that somehow changes who you are, or forever adjusts what terms you can apply to yourself. I mean, you might as well say, well, if you were breastfed, then your mouth touched a boobie, and you're forever a sexual person because you touched a boobie. You know what I mean? It's like it's absurd at this point to say that anything that you did as a child that you may not even remember must describe something about who you are as an adult or as a maturing individual if you're like a teenager or something. So I'm going to go ahead and read the conversation. And, you know, I'm not trying to name and shame, but I do find it kind of funny that the person chose the username Simply Objective. Because you know how the science bros often do that. They're like, oh, my conversation with you is not at all emotional. It's objective, and it's true. So here's what they said to me. This person posted on one of my videos and said, according to polling, there's no significant difference in the rates of masturbation between sexuals and asexuals, and according to science, there's no notable correlation between asexuality and arousal or orgasmic disorders. This makes the statement, some asexuals masturbate, very misleading. Also, in an earlier video, you admitted to masturbating, including in public. I don't know. As confirmed by your parents. So denying doing so on TV during a discussion on asexual libido was very misleading, even if you won't no longer do it. Yeah, I have no idea what he's talking about. Well, actually, I don't know if it's a he, but what they're talking about regarding public masturbate. I'm like, what exactly did I say that was construed as that? Yeah, I don't recall that. Anyway, so I said this. I'm not following how some asexual people masturbate implies how many do. It states that some do and some don't. Just like non-asexual people. That's very misleading is a really weird way to interpret that. Also not following why you're referencing masturbating in public, or why you're implying I'm obscuring statements I've made in other videos with anything I've said in this one. Discussing openly that I went through a phase as a child that many children go through is not weird, and it does not in any way suggest that this requires me to admit to it in conversations that are about whether I have a libido or masturbate, which I don't. Don't make comments accusing me of denying and being misleading when you're having to rearrange and reframe things I've said to make them seem contradictory. So they come back and say, I've never heard anyone say some people eat fruits and vegetables. People simply don't use the header some people when referencing an activity the large majority of people engage in. They instead use words like majority or most. Some people can see, some people can hear. Try this for yourself with any example that applies to the large majority. So yes, considering the context, your use of this phrasing was undeniably misleading. Lastly, I never said you masturbate, but only that as a child you did, as confirmed by your parents. Childhood libido, regardless of what subsequently took place, is used by therapists to rule out genetic arousal disorders. They then focus on disease, medication, or psychology. So yes, in the context of a discussion about asexual libido, answering no to the question was undeniably misleading. People with congenital arousal disorder, by definition, don't go through a childhood phase of self-exploration. I don't want to call you out, and actually appreciated your attention to detail in this video, but it's clear your shame around masturbation is overshadowing your desire to accurately represent asexuality. So I said this. I don't see the purpose in specifying how many people masturbate. Some is fine. This isn't a scientific statement I'm making. Don't talk about my statements like I'm lying to people because I wasn't specific about what some means. No, masturbating as a child is not libido. No, it isn't misleading to answer that you don't experience yourself to have a sex drive if you ever touched your genitals when you were a kid. You shouldn't conflate those things, and you especially shouldn't use your conflation of those things to accuse someone of having shame. It would be kind of silly of me to voluntarily make materials where I admit such things if I'm trying to get all hush-hush cover-up about it. There's no need to graft attitudes onto people whose beliefs and attitudes you don't know. If you believe this is a call-out, you're mistaken. So they said this, quoting me, "No, masturbating as a child is not libido." And they said, "I'm a college-educated biologist, and all my references clearly define libido as a sexual urge that includes sex and masturbation. In regards to why the question is important, if you tell people you don't drive, they instinctively ask if you take the bus, ride a bike, and so on. So when you hear, 'I don't have sex with people,' everybody instinctively thinks you do have it with yourself. It is without a doubt the most obvious and relevant question. If there was no shame, like asking if you ride a bike or rub your elbow, then asexuals would answer the question, and the whole world would have a better understanding of asexuality, i.e., same libido, just no desire to sleep with anyone. Instead, you're misleading people by using pointless phrasing, some people. So 0.1 to 99.9% do, when it already has been shown that the rates are comparable. You then, despite being unusually intelligent, make embarrassingly stupid statements, like masturbating as a child is not libido. So when I said masturbation shame, I wasn't just referring to yours, but to that of the entire asexual community. Are you gay? This is a stupid question, yet you answer it in depth without artifice. The only reason you didn't respond the same way to "do you masturbate" is because of shame. I said this, "You've got an awful lot of investment in your belief about what words I choose mean, and I think it's a little sketchy that you're this fixated on transforming masturbation discussions in our community into widespread collective shame, but you do you, buddy." So they said this, "I'm asexual and no less a member of this community than you are. I've never had or wanted sex. I've never even had a sex dream or masturbated to people having sex in porn, and unlike you, I didn't masturbate as a child. I also, too, have a desire for broader and more accurate representation of the asexual community. So when I saw you misrepresent the asexual community on TV because of the masturbation shame that is plaguing our community, I was very disappointed. The first question everyone will think, and should think, when told about not having sex with others is if you have sex with yourself. And an honest answer to this question is crucial when communicating what asexuality is to others. You know full well that the only reason an honest and clear answer isn't given is because of shame. Your failure to concede something as obvious as this is itself proof of the shame. All the best, bye." So that, I didn't feel like it was necessary to respond to someone who's putting words in my mouth there. But the thing is, there is nothing shameful about masturbation, and that's why I say some people do it, some people don't. I haven't personally even studied whether there's much of a difference. I was under the impression that there was no difference, just like this person said. I don't see what is indicative of shame if I'm using the word some. And I also don't see how someone construes me as being ashamed if I'm talking about, gladly talking about something that that I went through a phase of doing, like, a very normal thing, that I'm specifying it's a very normal thing. And, it doesn't have the same context as an adult. I've made that very clear. I've also talked to other people in the community that do talk about, like, in an asexual context, they'll talk about their masturbation habits. Somebody that I know who wrote a book about it, one of the self-published asexuality titles, said he thinks about furniture. Like, he kind of said it in a joking way, but he's like, "I don't really think about anything. I just think about, oh, that feels good." And that's why he does it. He doesn't think about anything in a sexual context. But it's also true that, I've had some extensive conversations with people who talk about fantasies and whatnot, and they say, like, if they have sex dreams or if they have sexual fantasies, they themselves often are not in them, or they're not actually thinking about something that they would like to happen to themselves. And then there's also the fact that, this gets really nuanced at this point, but some people will say asexuality describes who you're attracted to, or whether you experience attraction. It doesn't necessarily encompass whether you would like to have experiences that involve sexual release or sexual stimulation. And this kind of ties in also with some folks who talk about kinky experiences, BDSM, and some of those folks, will experience sexual gratification from experiences they can go through that have nothing to do with who they're attracted to, and some of them still may identify as asexual if they're not getting any of their thrills from being attracted to someone. So, I mean, it might sound like kind of nitpicking at that point, but, these do get really complicated sometimes when you only experience bits and parts of an overall experience that is usually assumed to include everything. Like, typically, you're supposed to be sexually and romantically attracted to the person who turns you on, and you're supposed to have sex with them. And all of those things are not given when you're asexual, or you may lack one of those elements. You don't have to pick it apart if you don't want to. If you're have less libido, or you don't really enjoy sex even though you're romantically or sexually attracted to someone, you can use the terminology that we've been developing in our community to try to figure out how to most accurately describe it, but you don't have to. Nobody has to sit there and be like, well, I'm a non-libidoist asexual with a history of going through a childhood phase where I masturbated. It's not necessary to rattle off a long list of how you identify, but if you want to, those terms are available to discuss it in more detail. I identify as asexual, and if you ask me about my libido, I'm non-libidoist. I certainly will admit that, if there is a scientific context in which people are using the term libido that is, broader in the case of discussing, a sexual experiment or something, like this person, I didn't miss what the person said. They said that their scientific literature, all of it, defined sexual experiences, defined libido, I guess they said, as encompassing sexual experiences and masturbation. And I'm like, I don't really care if that's how you're using it in the context of a scientific experiment. Because, if you learn anything as a scientist, you understand that terms are context dependent. And, the term scientific theory means a very different thing from theory in a layman's context. And I don't know about most of y'all, but, most of the asexual community is not scientists. We're not. I'm not a scientist. That's fine. I can still study and understand some of the scientific experiments and investigations that have gone on about my community, but that doesn't mean I'm a scientist. And it also doesn't mean that I necessarily am using the terms in scientific contexts when I talk about them in layman's terms like I would on a television show. So, when I say I don't have sex, I'm not saying that I don't have sex organs, but some scientists have certainly come onto my videos saying, like, you can't say that because you have sex organs, so by definition, you're a sexual creature. And I'm like, that's completely not what I was talking about, though. Like, if you want to say that anything that has sexual organs is about sex, then you're misconstruing the whole conversation that we're trying to have. You're derailing, and you're trying to have a conversation that isn't the conversation we were having. I think that it does a lot more damage to us as a community to pull stuff apart like that and claim that this is about shame when, I'm one of the most shameless people that I can think of in the community, where I will talk openly about my life. And, just because I will talk about my experiences as being a non-libidoist person who does not experience herself to have a sex drive doesn't mean that I must be hiding something because, there was this phase that I talk about that I went through as a child. It's not like, oh, I'm ashamed of that, or that I'm ashamed to incorporate that into my identity. Why would I voluntarily make videos that nobody is paying me to make? If I was ashamed to talk about that, why wouldn't I just pretend that I never touched my genitals in my whole life? It's like, you might as well say that if somebody has a lesion on their penis, then it's a sexual disorder, or if you have cervical cancer, then you have a sexual disease. You know, it's like, it's pointless to associate anything that has something to do with your genitals with sex. And I think actually, if you want to get into shame, if you are obsessed with associating anything that has something to do with your genitals with a sexual context, and you can't separate that in your mind as being sexual versus a part of the human anatomy, I think that betrays a lot more about maybe shame, maybe ridiculous need to contextualize anything about genitals with sex. I think that says a lot more about a person who can't separate those things than it does anything about shame that you're trying desperately to assign to me. That was really just, I felt really attacked by that. Not by, discussions of masturbation, but by this idea that I'm doing a disservice to my community because of some shame that I supposedly am experiencing. And it's like, I'm really confused what makes somebody that aggressive about this. Like, and you'll notice that there was this part where the person kind of went into detail about, like, well, I don't do that, I never did that, and unlike you, I never touched myself. It's like, how is that relevant? Are you saying that you get to be proud of that and I shouldn't be? Or are you saying the opposite, which is kind of what it seemed like they were saying, where they were saying that I shouldn't be ashamed of it, but I clearly am? And, like, where do you get that? Where do you get a shame reaction? It seemed like they were kind of trying to connect the fact that I said some people do this, some people don't, with, like, a clear personal shame that I must be carrying. But, like, that's reading an awful lot into something that doesn't mean what you're saying it means. So, I don't have the specific data on how many do and how many don't. I got the impression that, a lot of people masturbate, and a lot of people in the asexual community are no exception to that. But I'm not going to state numbers. I'm not going to imply numbers. And I'm also not going to accept that I am misrepresenting people because I used a vague term. Like, as if I'm trying to minimize how many people do this. The fact is, I don't have specific data on that, and it's not a failing on my part that I don't have specific data on that. So that's kind of my my assessment of that. But I will leave you with a reiteration that masturbation is not something that asexual people can't do. I've certainly heard in my comments multiple times from people insisting that if you masturbate, you are doing a sexual thing and therefore you're not asexual, so accept it. And I'm like, I'm not even talking about myself at this point, but I defend the inclusion of asexual people who masturbate, and I will absolutely insist that people who have sex and people who masturbate and people who do neither of those things, all of us are equally asexual if that is how we experience our orientation and our attraction experiences. Behavior being separate from orientation is one of the very basic bedrock understandings that a lot of our discussions revolve around. And if you can't separate those things, if you're unwilling to acknowledge that behavior doesn't define identity, then I can't even begin to have the conversation with you. So hopefully that sheds some light on this, and I'll see you guys next time.